More than 5,000 years before the Tower of Babel entered written tradition, the low alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia were already reshaping human organization on a scale never seen before. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, early communities confronted a challenge that would define the course of history: how to manage water, labor, and population across an unstable landscape with no natural boundaries. The solutions developed here laid the foundations for urban life, state administration, and monumental construction. Southern Mesopotamia possessed no stone, timber, or metal resources of its own. Its defining feature was its river system, unpredictable, seasonally flooding, and capable of both destruction and abundance. Archaeological surveys indicate that by the 6th millennium BCE, Neolithic communities had begun constructing small-scale irrigation canals to control floodwaters and extend arable land. These early interventions transformed marshland into productive fields, enabling permanent settlement in an otherwise marginal environment. Records indicate that control of water became the primary determinant of survival and social stability. During the Ubaid period, approximately 6000 to 4000 BCE, settlements expanded in size and complexity across southern Mesopotamia. Excavations at Eridu, often identified as one of the earliest cities, reveal continuous occupation layers marked by increasingly elaborate mud brick architecture. Pottery typologies from this period show standardization across wide regions, suggesting shared cultural practices and inter-settlement coordination. These findings indicate that local communities were no longer isolated villages, but part of a broader regional system linked by trade, labor exchange, and religious practice. Central to Ubaid society was the emergence of temple institutions. Archaeologists uncovered large tripartite buildings at Eridu and Uruk that differ markedly from domestic structures in scale and layout. These buildings functioned as economic and ritual centers, storing grain, redistributing surplus, and coordinating labor. Administrative control preceded political kingship. Authority was exercised through religious institutions that regulated agricultural output and organized communal projects. This system demonstrates how early hierarchy emerged from economic management rather than military domination. By the late 5th millennium BCE, population density in southern Mesopotamia increased significantly. Settlement surveys show that villages clustered around canal networks, forming dense habitation zones capable of supporting thousands of inhabitants. This concentration of population required new mechanisms of coordination. Archaeologists uncovered seal impressions, accounting tokens, and early numerical markings that point to the development of administrative record-keeping. These systems allowed temple officials to track production, labor obligations, and resource distribution with increasing precision. The transition into the Uruk period, beginning around 4000 BCE, marked a decisive transformation. Uruk itself expanded to cover over 250 hectares, making it the largest settlement in the world at the time. Excavations reveal monumental precincts such as the Iana complex, characterized by massive platforms, standardized brick sizes, and axial planning. These features indicate centralized oversight and long-term construction planning. According to stratigraphic evidence, such projects required sustained labor mobilization across generations, supported by agricultural surplus and administrative authority. Writing emerged within this context of urban complexity. The earliest proto-cuneiform tablets, dated to approximately 3300 BCE, were discovered at Uruk and consist primarily of economic records. These tablets document livestock counts, grain rations, and labor assignments rather than narrative or religious texts. This evidence demonstrates that writing developed as a managerial tool, enabling large institutions to function across time and space. Linguistic diversity already existed, but administrative systems imposed functional uniformity. Trade networks expanded alongside urban growth. Materials such as obsidian, lapis lazuli, copper, and timber were imported from Anatolia, Iran, and Central Asia. Archaeological evidence indicates that Mesopotamian cities were deeply embedded in long-distance exchange systems, despite lacking raw materials themselves. These networks reinforced the economic power of temple institutions and further differentiated social roles within urban populations. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamia had become the world's first sustained urban civilization. Its cities were not accidental concentrations of population, but engineered environments shaped by irrigation, administration, and religious authority. Social hierarchy emerged through control of surplus rather than conquest, while monumental architecture reflected institutional continuity rather than individual ambition. These systemic developments created the physical and organizational conditions necessary for large-scale sacred construction. As cities expanded and authority consolidated, architecture increasingly became a visible expression of political and religious power, setting the stage for the monumental sacred structures that would later define Mesopotamian civilization. For continued access to daily, academically grounded historical documentaries, consider subscribing, enabling notifications, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. In Mesopotamia, height was not defiance, it was devotion. As early urban societies expanded across the southern alluvial plains, religious architecture developed alongside systems of administration and resource control. Temples were among the first monumental structures constructed in Mesopotamian cities, reflecting the central role of cult institutions in organizing economic and social life. Archaeological evidence indicates that these buildings were not peripheral religious additions but foundational elements of urban planning. Excavations at Eridu, traditionally associated with the god Enki, reveal a sequence of superimposed temple structures beginning in the 6th millennium BCE. Each rebuilding phase followed a similar ground plan, gradually increasing in elevation through successive platforms. This pattern demonstrates continuity of cult practice rather than architectural experimentation. Archaeologists uncovered altars, offering tables, and storage rooms, indicating that these temples functioned as ritual and economic centers. The vertical accumulation of structures resulted not from sudden ambition but from long-term institutional maintenance. By the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods, temple architecture evolved into more complex forms. At Uruk, the Yana precinct presents clear evidence of large-scale religious construction coordinated over extended periods. The precinct contained multiple temples, courtyards, and administrative spaces arranged according to axial planning principles. Standardized mud brick sizes and consistent orientation reflect centralized oversight. Records indicate that temple officials controlled labor, food distribution, and craft production, embedding religious architecture within broader systems of governance. The ziggurat emerged from this architectural tradition during the late 4th and early 3rd millennia BCE. Unlike earlier temples built at ground level, ziggurats consisted of stacked platforms rising above the surrounding cityscape. Archaeologists uncovered early examples at Uruk and later fully developed structures at Ur and Babylon. These towers were constructed using sun-dried mud brick cores reinforced with fired brick facings and bitumen mortar, ensuring stability against erosion and seasonal flooding. Cuneiform inscriptions provide essential context for understanding the function of ziggurats. Royal building texts consistently describe these structures as houses of the god or foundations linking heaven and earth. The most frequently cited example, Etemenanke in Babylon, is named in Sumerian as the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Such terminology reflects cosmological symbolism rather than physical aspiration. The tower marked a sacred point of contact between divine and human realms, not an attempt to penetrate the sky. Importantly, ziggurats were not congregational spaces. Archaeologists found no evidence of large interior halls or public assembly areas within the towers themselves. Ritual activity occurred at the summit shrine, accessible only to priests, while offerings and administrative tasks were managed in surrounding temple complexes. This restricted access underscores the role of religious specialists and reinforces the hierarchical nature of Mesopotamian society. Administrative tablets recovered from temple precincts document the logistical demands of maintaining these structures. Records include allocations of grain to laborers, inventories of building materials, and schedules for ritual offerings. These texts demonstrate that ziggurat construction and upkeep were institutional projects supported by surplus agricultural production. Monumentality, therefore, was not an expression of individual authority but a visible outcome of systemic economic organization. Architectural continuity across centuries further supports this interpretation. Ziggurats were rebuilt, repaired, and expanded by successive rulers, often invoking earlier kings to legitimize their work. This practice reinforced religious stability and political continuity within rapidly changing urban environments. Height symbolized permanence and cosmic order in a landscape defined by environmental instability. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, stepped temple towers had become a defining feature of Mesopotamian religious architecture. Their form, function, and symbolism were well established long before later textual traditions emerged. These structures expressed an ordered universe governed by divine hierarchy, maintained through ritual precision and institutional authority. As Mesopotamian cities projected their religious architecture across the plains, the visual and symbolic power of these towers extended beyond their original cultural context, later entering mythic and scriptural traditions in transformed ways. Mesopotamia was never linguistically unified, but it was administratively connected. As urban centers grew in size and complexity during the late Ubaid and Uruk periods, the need for coordinated resource management and labor organization became critical. Archaeologists have demonstrated that the earliest forms of writing, proto-cuneiform, emerged around 3300 BCE primarily as a tool for accounting. Clay tokens, initially used to represent quantities of grain, livestock, or labor, evolved into inscribed tablets, providing permanent records for temple administrators. These developments indicate that literacy was closely tied to institutional governance rather than to general communication among the population. Proto-cuneiform inscriptions from Uruk and surrounding sites document distributions of rations, allocations of raw materials, and records of work crews assigned to specific construction projects. For example, tablets cataloging grain deliveries for temple personnel at the Yana precinct show standardized numerical signs and symbols that allowed for precise calculation across thousands of individuals. Archaeologists have noted that these accounting systems enabled religious authorities to mobilize labor and control surplus without relying on centralized monarchy in the early stages. Institutional literacy functioned as a unifying mechanism, creating functional consistency across culturally and linguistically diverse communities. By the early 3rd millennium BCE, writing had stabilized into standardized cuneiform, which could be adapted to multiple languages. Sumerian, a language isolate, dominated administrative and literary contexts, while Akkadian, a Semitic language, became increasingly used for diplomatic correspondence and trade documentation. Evidence from bilingual lexical lists, royal inscriptions, and administrative tablets demonstrates that scribes routinely navigated between these languages. Linguistic diversity, therefore, coexisted with centralized management, illustrating that early Mesopotamian cities did not rely on a single spoken language for coordination. Instead, a specialized class of literate officials ensured consistency through codified signs and procedures. The institutional use of writing also extended to legal and economic authority. Early codes, such as the Code of Ur-Nammu from Ur around 2100 BCE, relied on written records to standardize penalties, obligations, and property ownership. Temple and palace scribes monitored these records, linking religious authority to civic administration. Archaeological evidence, including clay tablets and cylinder seals, confirms that this bureaucratic infrastructure supported large-scale projects, including temple construction, canal maintenance, and city fortifications. These administrative systems were designed to function independently of the spoken vernacular, relying instead on a uniform set of symbols and procedural norms. Multilingual administration was particularly significant in the context of intercity trade and regional expansion. Excavations at sites such as Kish, Nippur, and Mari show that scribes recorded transactions involving commodities from distant regions, including Anatolia, Iran, and the Levant. Standardized cuneiform enabled accurate communication across diverse linguistic communities, reinforcing economic cohesion and political oversight. These mechanisms illustrate an early model of governance in which communication systems were deliberately codified for administrative efficiency rather than cultural homogeneity. Records also demonstrate that literacy and bureaucracy were closely linked to social hierarchy. Scribes, who underwent extensive training in scribal schools, held elevated status within temple and palace hierarchies. Control of knowledge, combined with oversight of material resources, allowed these officials to exercise authority over both urban populations and rural laborers. In this context, power was institutional rather than personal, embedded in systems of accountability and record-keeping rather than in a single ruler's charisma or military capability. This historical reality stands in contrast to later portrayals of a primordial unified language, as reflected in the biblical Tower of Babel narrative. Whereas the Genesis account suggests an original linguistic homogeneity disrupted by divine intervention, Mesopotamian evidence reveals that linguistic plurality was managed pragmatically through writing and administration. The co-occurrence of multiple spoken languages did not impede large-scale cooperation, demonstrating that centralized coordination could succeed without erasing diversity. By the end of the Uruk period, Mesopotamian cities had established enduring administrative frameworks that integrated labor, resource management, and religious obligations. Writing provided a reliable mechanism for recording transactions, maintaining order, and sustaining monumental construction projects. These systems formed the organizational backbone for the temples and ziggurats that defined the urban landscape. These administrative realities would later be transformed into theological narrative, setting the stage for the symbolic representation of language and power in the Tower of Babel story. Babylon's power grew not only through conquest, but through memory. During the early 2nd millennium BCE, Babylon transitioned from a relatively minor urban center in southern Mesopotamia to a politically and culturally significant city-state. Archaeological evidence shows continuous occupation layers dating to the Islamic period, with increasing complexity in urban planning and monumental architecture. Excavations reveal that early Babylonian settlements were organized around temple precincts and residential districts, indicating coordinated civic management and the central role of cultic institutions in governance. Political consolidation accelerated under the Amorite dynasties, culminating in Hammurabi's reign, circa 1792 to 1750 BCE. Royal inscriptions describe Hammurabi as both a military leader and a divinely sanctioned administrator, emphasizing the integration of secular authority with religious legitimacy. The surviving law code of Hammurabi, inscribed on basalt steels and discovered at Susa, demonstrates the codification of civil, economic, and religious regulations. These laws centralized judicial and administrative power, enabling Babylon to exert control over surrounding territories and standardize governance across a rapidly expanding domain. The elevation of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, played a central role in the city's symbolic authority. Inscriptions and hymns indicate that Marduk's cult was deliberately promoted to consolidate religious loyalty, integrating the deities of conquered cities into a hierarchical pantheon under Marduk's supremacy. Temple complexes in Babylon, including early precursors to the Asagila, functioned as centers of ritual, administration, and economic redistribution. Archaeological layers reveal successive construction phases, with bricks stamped with Hammurabi's name, reflecting both civic pride and enduring institutional memory. Military organization also contributed to Babylon's rise. Textual evidence, including year names and royal inscriptions, documents campaigns against neighboring city-states such as Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari. These campaigns were often framed as divinely sanctioned actions, linking conquest to both political strategy and religious ideology. Strategic control over river courses and trade routes reinforced Babylon's economic base, providing the resources necessary for large-scale building projects and temple maintenance. Economic administration relied on centralized record-keeping. Cuneiform tablets recovered from temple and palace archives document grain allocations, labor drafts, and taxation for both urban and rural populations. These records indicate that Babylon's rulers maintained oversight of agricultural production, craft specialization, and trade networks extending across Mesopotamia. Surplus resources were channeled into state projects, including fortifications, temple renovations, and urban infrastructure, demonstrating the interdependence of economic control and political authority. Urban growth also shaped social hierarchy. Residential districts reveal planned neighborhoods differentiated by proximity to temple precincts and palaces, suggesting stratification based on administrative and occupational roles. Archaeologists have identified workshop areas and artisan quarters, showing that economic specialization was closely integrated with the city's bureaucratic structures. These organizational patterns provided stability and continuity, reinforcing the centralized power of both secular and religious leadership. Hammurabi's legacy extended beyond immediate political conquest. Royal inscriptions emphasize historical memory, portraying the king as a restorer of order who preserved divine favor and maintained urban continuity. Temple construction, law codification, and archival practices all contributed to Babylon's enduring prominence, ensuring that the city would remain a reference point for subsequent generations across the Near East. By the mid-2nd millennium BCE, Babylon had established itself as the leading city-state in southern Mesopotamia. Its political consolidation, religious centralization, and economic administration formed a durable model of urban empire. Marduk's elevation to the apex of the pantheon reinforced the city's symbolic authority, while monumental architecture and archival practices preserved institutional memory. These developments laid the groundwork for Babylon's later mythic status, as remembered in biblical texts and other Near Eastern literature. As Babylon's religious importance expanded, its monuments gained cosmic meaning. The city's temple complexes and early ziggurats were not only centers of administration and ritual, but also visible symbols of political and theological order, setting the stage for the monumental constructions that would later be associated with the Tower of Babel narrative. The Tower of Babel had a name, and it stood in Babylon. Archaeological and textual evidence identifies this structure as Etemenanke, the great ziggurat of the city, dedicated to Marduk. Excavations on the site of ancient Babylon, located near modern Hilla, Iraq, have uncovered the ziggurat's foundational remains, revealing a massive square base measuring approximately 91 meters on each side. Historical sources indicate that the ziggurat rose in multiple terraces, possibly reaching over 90 meters in height. Its stepped form was constructed with mudbrick cores reinforced by baked brick facings, bonded with bitumen to provide stability against seasonal flooding and natural erosion. Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE, oversaw a significant reconstruction of Etemenanke. Cuneiform inscriptions attributed to the king describe the project in detail, noting the transport of building materials from surrounding regions, the allocation of laborers, and the dedication of the completed structure to Marduk. Tablets from Babylonian archives indicate that the project involved thousands of workers, coordinated through temple and palace administration. The inscriptions specify that offerings and ritual activities were conducted at the summit shrine, accessible only to priests, confirming that the ziggurat served as both a religious and ceremonial center. Classical authors, including Herodotus, provide additional evidence for Etemenanke's prominence. Herodotus describes a towering structure in Babylon, noting its elevated terraces and central shrine. While his measurements are imprecise, they correspond broadly with archaeological reconstructions. Later Greek and Roman writers continued to reference the tower as a defining feature of Babylon, often emphasizing its visibility across the surrounding plain and its monumental scale. Architectural analysis indicates that Etemenanke followed the standard Mesopotamian ziggurat model. Each terrace receded inwards, forming a stepped pyramid with an inclined ramp system for processions and ritual movement. Foundations were reinforced with layers of mudbrick and baked brick, while drainage systems protected the structure from water damage. Excavations have revealed fragments of baked bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar's name, confirming royal sponsorship and linking construction to official temple administration. The tower functioned as a ceremonial axis, connecting the city's temple precinct to the symbolic center of the cosmos. Rituals conducted at Etemenanke included offerings, processional activities, and seasonal festivals aligned with the agricultural calendar. Administrative tablets and dedicatory inscriptions demonstrate that priests monitored ritual observances and managed resources required for the tower's maintenance. The structure's design reflects long-term institutional planning rather than a single construction campaign. Evidence from Babylonian archives also documents the logistical scale of the project. Records indicate systematic transport of mud, baked bricks, bitumen, and timber from surrounding regions, coordinated through the city's economic administration. Laborers were organized into groups with specific roles, including brickmaking, construction, and ceremonial duties. These administrative records illustrate the integration of economic management with religious function, enabling the completion of monumental structures on a consistent and sustainable basis. Edamananke's prominence is further supported by its location within Babylon's urban layout. The ziggurat occupied the center of the Asagila temple precinct, adjacent to the main sanctuary of Marduk. Surrounding courtyards, storage facilities, and administrative offices indicate that the complex served as both a ritual center and a hub for economic management. Excavations have documented the presence of ceremonial staircases, offering altars, and associated cultic artifacts, providing material evidence for the ziggurat's religious function. Textual and archaeological sources indicate that Edamananke remained a significant structure until the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE. Historical accounts describe subsequent partial demolitions and neglect, with later rebuildings during Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid periods. Despite its destruction, the foundational platform and associated artifacts provide a clear record of the tower's dimensions, construction methods, and ceremonial role. By combining archaeological evidence, royal inscriptions, and classical accounts, Edamananke can be reliably identified as the monumental structure most closely associated with the Tower of Babel tradition. Its size, urban prominence, and role in Babylonian ritual practices establish it as a tangible historical reference. Records confirm that it was both a center of religious observance and an administrative hub, reflecting the integration of sacred and civic authority. The tower's meaning would shift dramatically outside Mesopotamian culture. While Edamananke functioned within Babylonian religious and administrative systems, subsequent textual traditions transformed its representation, connecting architectural grandeur with symbolic narratives of linguistic and divine interaction. Babylon was admired, feared, and remembered long after its walls fell. From the early 1st millennium BCE, the city became a focal point for regional diplomacy, trade, and military strategy across the Near East. Assyrian inscriptions, particularly from rulers such as Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib, document campaigns in Mesopotamia that reference Babylon both as a military objective and as a center of wealth and culture. The Assyrians recognized the city's symbolic and practical importance, repeatedly recording sieges, tributes, and rebuilding efforts, reflecting Babylon's status as a prize of imperial contestation. Economic correspondence from the Neo-Assyrian period highlights Babylon's role in regional exchange networks. Tablets recovered from Nineveh and Assur list shipments of grain, textiles, and luxury goods originating from Babylon, demonstrating the city's continued centrality in trade. These records also indicate administrative oversight of revenue, including tribute payments from surrounding territories. Such documentation underscores that Babylon's influence extended beyond its urban core, integrating political authority with economic reach across Mesopotamia. Persian sources, following Cyrus the Great's conquest in 539 BCE, further illustrate Babylon's enduring prominence. The Cyrus Cylinder records the king's peaceful entry into the city and his restoration of temples, emphasizing Babylon's religious and civic significance. Archaeological layers corroborate large-scale repairs and maintenance, confirming that Babylon remained a functioning administrative and cultic center under Achaemenid rule. These actions demonstrate that successive empires valued the city not solely for its population or fortifications, but for its symbolic role as a locus of continuity and legitimacy. In parallel, Levantine and Hebrew texts reflect growing awareness of Babylon as a cultural and political symbol. Diplomatic correspondence from the Amarna archives demonstrates recognition of Mesopotamian power, while later biblical texts situate Babylon as the archetype of imperial dominance. During the Babylonian exile c. 597 to 538 BCE, Jewish communities encountered the city directly, integrating first-hand experience with inherited cultural narratives. These accounts preserve both historical memory and evolving perception, indicating that Babylon's reputation was constructed through a combination of observation, political reality, and transmitted stories. The city's monumental architecture reinforced its regional image. Descriptions of Edamananke, the city walls, and the Ishtar Gate in cuneiform texts and classical sources emphasize scale, decoration, and ceremonial function. Reliefs recovered from Neo-Assyrian palaces depict Babylonian structures in stylized form, suggesting recognition of their symbolic as well as practical significance. Archaeological evidence, including brick inscriptions, administrative archives, and temple dedications, confirms that Babylon's grandeur was both materially present and institutionally maintained, contributing to its perception as a dominant urban and ritual center. Babylon's military and administrative presence shaped surrounding territories. Assyrian annals record repeated campaigns to suppress uprisings in the Babylonian region, indicating the persistence of local identity and resistance. Despite periods of subjugation, Babylonian culture, religious practice, and urban organization continued, suggesting that the city maintained symbolic and operational authority. The continuity of temple rites, royal inscriptions, and administrative frameworks reinforced its enduring reputation in both conquered and neighboring lands. Literary references from external sources further document Babylon's significance. Cuneiform letters, royal inscriptions, and classical texts repeatedly associate the city with governance, wealth, and cosmopolitan influence. These materials reveal that Babylon functioned as both a tangible urban entity and a conceptual model of imperial authority. Its prominence in trade, religion, and administration ensured that it remained central to regional consciousness, long after its physical fortifications were damaged or rebuilt by successive powers. The interplay between Babylon's material presence and its perception across the Near East illustrates how urban centers can achieve lasting symbolic power. Diplomatic texts, tribute records, and literary references show that Babylon's identity was reinforced through both political interaction and cultural memory. Successive empires engaged with the city not merely for its resources, but for its capacity to convey legitimacy, stability, and continuity in Mesopotamian civilization. By the end of the 6th century BCE, Babylon had established itself as a reference point for both local populations and foreign observers. Its monumental architecture, administrative sophistication, and ritual centrality created a durable framework for historical memory. These combined factors allowed Babylon to become emblematic of urban, religious, and political authority throughout the Near East, setting the stage for its later reinterpretation in Hebrew scripture. This symbolic weight would be reframed through theological narrative, as the city's architecture, religious centrality, and imperial prominence were transformed into stories connecting human ambition, divine authority, and linguistic multiplicity in later biblical traditions. The story of Babel occupies just 9 verses, but reshaped centuries of thought. Genesis 11 verses 1-9 presents a brief narrative in the primeval history of the Hebrew Bible, situated immediately after the flood account and before the introduction of the patriarchs. The passage describes a single human community, speaking one language, settling in the land of Shinar, and attempting to build a city with a tower whose top reaches the heavens. The text concludes with divine intervention, the confounding of language and the dispersion of people across the earth. Despite its brevity, this narrative serves multiple literary and theological functions, providing an etiological explanation for human linguistic diversity and urban settlement patterns. Source-critical analysis situates Genesis 11 within the broader framework of the Yahwist, J, and priestly P sources. The description of a unified language and collective action corresponds with motifs found in J traditions, emphasizing human initiative and social cohesion. The narrative's succinct, structured form, beginning with a problem, followed by human action, divine response, and consequence, reflects the compositional techniques of early Israelite historiography. Scholars note the parallelism between Babel and the preceding flood narrative, as both episodes involve human hubris, divine judgment, and the reshaping of social order. Linguistic evidence further illuminates the text. The Hebrew term Babel, meaning to confuse or confound, appears in the divine pronouncement in Genesis 11 verse 7, linking the etymology of Babel to the disruption of language. Hebrew scholars have analyzed the wordplay, noting that the narrative establishes a causal relationship between the place name and the linguistic phenomenon. The text's economy of language and repetition reinforces its pedagogical function, conveying moral and theological points in concise narrative form. Literary structure also contributes to the story's enduring impact. Genesis 11 opens with a general statement about human migration and settlement, establishes a specific location, Shinar, and then describes the construction of a monumental tower. The narrative culminates in divine intervention, which both explains observable human diversity and situates human activity within a theological framework. This structure demonstrates the text's dual function as history and didactic ideological tale, simultaneously recounting events and providing interpretive meaning. Intertextual comparison indicates possible influences from Mesopotamian traditions. Babylonian and Sumerian texts describe large urban projects, ziggurats, and centralized authority, sometimes involving monumental constructions that symbolically connect the human and divine realms. While Genesis 11 does not explicitly reference Etemenanke or any specific Babylonian monument, the similarities in scale, urban context, and cultural memory suggest that the narrative may reflect collective knowledge of Mesopotamian cities and their ceremonial towers. Archaeological findings, including the Neo-Babylonian reconstruction of Etemenanke and earlier ziggurats, provide a material backdrop against which the text's imagery can be understood. The passage also engages with the theme of linguistic diversity as a social and political force. By framing the dispersion of peoples as a consequence of divine action, the text addresses observable multilingualism in the ancient Near East while asserting theological causality. This aligns with historical realities. The region contained numerous spoken languages and dialects, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Amorite, and later Aramaic, yet administrative practices and writing systems facilitated coordination across linguistic boundaries. Genesis 11 transforms this functional complexity into a narrative of divine order and human limitation. Chronologically, the composition of the final form of Genesis 11 is generally placed in the early 1st millennium BCE, during or after the Babylonian exile. This context is significant. The narrative reflects Israelite encounters with Mesopotamian urban centers, temple complexes, and administrative sophistication. Biblical authors could synthesize historical observation, theological reflection, and memory of Babylonian civilization into a concise story that explained both urban ambition and linguistic diversity. The narrative's brevity contrasts with the complexity of its reference, demonstrating the literary skill of integrating historical memory into a theologically framed account. Textual variants also reveal interpretive layers. The Masoretic text, Septuagint, and Samaritan Pentateuch present minor differences in phrasing and terminology, highlighting the fluidity of transmission and the editorial processes shaping the text. Scholars note that such variations can illuminate ancient interpretive traditions, emphasizing different aspects of divine judgment, human ambition, or geographic localization. These differences underscore the story's function as a teaching narrative adaptable to multiple audiences over centuries. By combining literary analysis, linguistic observation, and historical context, Genesis 11 verses 1 to 9 can be understood as a compact yet sophisticated narrative. Its placement within the primeval history, use of wordplay, structured progression from settlement to divine intervention, and possible engagement with Mesopotamian cultural memory all contribute to its enduring significance. The story conveys both an ideological explanation for human language diversity and a broader framework for understanding human ambition in relation to divine authority. Understanding the text requires examining its historical context, including the real-world cities, administrative systems, and monumental architecture of Mesopotamia that informed the narrative's imagery and meaning. Babel was written after Babylon was experienced. Scholarly analysis situates the final composition of Genesis 11 within the period of the Babylonian exile, approximately the 6th century BCE. This dating is supported by linguistic, textual, and historical considerations. Hebrew used in the primeval history, including the Babel narrative, reflects features consistent with late biblical Hebrew, exhibiting lexical and syntactic patterns found in texts produced during or shortly after the exile. Source criticism identifies the narrative as likely emerging from the Yahwist, J, and Priestley P strands, which were later compiled into a unified text under editorial processes influenced by exile conditions. Historical context reinforces this assessment. By the 6th century BCE, Jerusalem had experienced destruction, deportation, and prolonged exposure to Babylonian institutions, urban planning, and religious practice. Israelite scribes and exiles were familiar with the city's monumental architecture, administrative systems, and temple-centered religious hierarchy. material and textual evidence from Babylon, including descriptions of ziggurats, palace complexes, and administrative archives, would have provided first-hand exposure to the scale and symbolism of the city. These experiences informed the narrative framing of Babel as a concentrated story of human ambition, linguistic diversity, and divine oversight. Linguistic and literary analysis of the text indicates deliberate structuring and concise composition. Genesis 11 verses 1-9 employs Hebrew vocabulary appropriate to 6th century scribal conventions, including terms describing language confusion, Babel, and urban construction, ir, city, Migdal, tower. The economy of language, repetitive phrasing, and tightly organized sequence reflect a tradition of oral and written transmission adapted to exile communities. Scholars note that the narrative demonstrates both historical awareness and literary refinement, integrating familiar concepts of urbanism and social cohesion within a theological framework. Comparative studies with Mesopotamian sources reveal significant parallels. Exilic authors would have been aware of Neo-Babylonian and earlier Mesopotamian urban and temple structures, including Etemenanki and other ziggurats. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the scale and ceremonial functions of these towers, including multi-terrace platforms, ritual summits, and centralized administrative oversight. While Genesis 11 does not describe Etemenanki directly, its imagery of a monumental, vertically oriented urban project aligns closely with the architectural realities encountered by exiles. This suggests that the narrative was composed with knowledge of Babylonian city planning and temple construction. Authorship is further illuminated through editorial and theological patterns. The Babel story is embedded within the primeval history, Genesis 1-11, which organizes sequences of creation, early humanity, and urban settlement to frame later covenantal history. The narrative functions ideologically, explaining why humanity is dispersed and linguistically divided. Its placement reflects deliberate literary design, linking observable social and linguistic phenomena in Mesopotamia with theological reflection appropriate to an exile context. Editors likely adapted oral traditions, regional knowledge, and prior textual motifs into a coherent, brief narrative that could be transmitted to communities displaced from their homeland. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Babylonian cultural knowledge was widespread among exiled communities. Administrative texts, temple inscriptions, and trade records would have provided models for urban organization, labor mobilization, and religious hierarchy. The Hebrew authors integrated these observations, abstracting concrete architectural and bureaucratic elements into symbolic narrative. The focus on a single tower and city condenses complex urban realities into an accessible ideological account, suitable for instruction and theological reflection within the exile community. The narrative also reflects the broader function of post-exilic historiography. By situating the story after the flood and before the patriarchal era, the editors emphasized moral, social, and theological themes. The limits of human initiative, the establishment of divine order, and the origins of cultural and linguistic diversity. These themes directly resonate with the exile experience, in which displacement, loss of political autonomy, and exposure to foreign urban systems demanded interpretive frameworks. Genesis 11 served as both historical reflection and didactic tool, preserving memory and conveying theological insight. Finally, source-critical analysis indicates that Genesis 11 synthesizes multiple traditions. Variants in the Masoretic text, Septuagint, and Samaritan Pentateuch show editorial layering, suggesting ongoing adaptation and clarification over several decades. The convergence of linguistic, literary, and historical evidence supports the conclusion that the Babel narrative reached its canonical form after Israelite exposure to Babylonian civilization, informed by direct observation and cultural experience rather than purely imaginative reconstruction. The narrative reflects theological response, not architectural memory, shaping human and divine interaction into a concise story. To understand its implications, it is necessary to examine how the story interprets historical realities, including urbanization, administration, and multilingualism, within a moral and religious framework that in Genesis, language is not communication, it is power. The Babel narrative presents human speech as a unifying force, emphasizing that a single language enabled collective planning, monumental construction, and coordinated settlement. Genesis 11 verse 1 opens with, "The whole earth had one language and the same words," situating linguistic unity as a precondition for societal cohesion. Linguistic uniformity facilitates collective action, enabling the construction of the city and the tower that rise together with human ambition. The text frames language itself as a functional instrument, linking social coordination to moral and theological evaluation. The disruption of speech in Genesis 11 verses 7 to 9 transforms language into a mechanism of divine intervention. The Hebrew verb balel, to confuse, describes the divine act of creating linguistic multiplicity. By separating human speech, the narrative introduces social and spatial differentiation. Scholars have noted that this moment establishes linguistic diversity as a marker of divine authority rather than a neutral cultural phenomenon. Language, in this context, operates as a symbolic expression of sovereignty, structuring human activity in relation to divine will. The narrative further associates language with human pride and limitation. The unified builder's declaration, "Let us make a name for ourselves," connects collective speech to identity formation and self-aggrandizement. In Hebrew, the term Shem, name, conveys both reputation and authority. Genesis positions the act of naming and coordinated linguistic expression within a theological framework, highlighting the tension between human initiative and divine oversight. The confounding of language demonstrates the text's emphasis on God's ultimate control over human society, reinforcing theological hierarchy through symbolic representation. Literary analysis indicates that the Babel story integrates linguistic, social, and spatial elements. The narrative links verbal unity to urban construction, situating language at the intersection of communication, organization, and ambition. By contrast, the subsequent dispersion correlates linguistic diversity with geographical and social fragmentation. This structured progression conveys moral and theological lessons. Human cooperation can achieve material results, but divine sovereignty regulates its scope. Linguistic disruption thus serves as both narrative pivot and ethical device. Theological interpretation of language in Genesis also engages with historical multilingualism. Archaeological and textual records from Mesopotamia reveal widespread linguistic plurality, including Sumerian, Akkadian, Amorite, and later Aramaic. Administrative systems, temple archives, and trade correspondence demonstrate that these societies maintained functional coordination despite diverse vernaculars. Genesis 11 abstracts this historical reality, transforming it into a narrative of divine causation rather than pragmatic administration. In doing so, the text reframes observable multilingualism as theological and moral commentary. Etymology and wordplay reinforce the narrative's symbolic focus. The Hebrew root Babel links the city's name, Babel, Bavel, to the act of confusing speech. Biblical authors use this linguistic correspondence to encode explanatory and didactic elements. This technique embeds language within the story as a tool for teaching and reflection. Linguistic manipulation serves narrative economy, enabling the text to convey complex social, moral, and theological concepts in a concise framework of 9 verses. The function of language as a theological instrument extends to identity formation. Genesis portrays collective speech as enabling centralized planning and urban development, establishing a shared cultural and symbolic horizon. Conversely, the scattering of people and the creation of multiple languages establish boundaries, diversity, and localized communities. Language thus becomes a primary vehicle for structuring human society in relation to divine authority. Textual repetition and narrative brevity reinforce this conceptual linkage, emphasizing the moral and social significance of linguistic plurality. Comparative studies suggest that the theological use of language in Genesis contrasts with contemporary Mesopotamian texts. While Babylonian inscriptions and administrative tablets record multilingual coordination as a practical reality, Genesis abstracts these experiences into narrative symbolism. The story does not aim to document linguistic diversity historically but to situate human speech within moral and cosmic frameworks. In doing so, the narrative transforms functional communication into a measure of divine human relations. By the conclusion of Genesis 11, language has moved from practical utility to theological instrument. Unity of speech facilitates human action, pride, and urban ambition. Its disruption enforces divine order, introduces social differentiation, and establishes moral boundaries. The narrative conveys that human coordination is both enabled and constrained by God, transforming language from a neutral mechanism of communication into a structured representation of power, hierarchy, and consequence. These ideas would echo far beyond ancient Israel, influencing subsequent interpretations of linguistic diversity, human ambition, and societal order in later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, as well as in cultural memory linked to the Tower of Babel. Long before Genesis, Mesopotamian texts already imagined a world of one language. The Sumerian epic Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, composed in the early 2nd millennium BCE and preserved in cuneiform tablets from Uruk, recounts a period in which humanity communicated in a single tongue. The narrative situates this linguistic unity within a political and cultic context, depicting the city of Uruk under King Enmerkar's rule and its relationship with the distant, resource-rich city of Aratta. Human speech is represented as a cohesive instrument of administration, diplomacy, and religious practice, facilitating monumental construction and state coordination. The epic describes how Enmerkar seeks tribute and loyalty from Aratta to support the Temple of Inanna in Uruk. Divine intervention enters the narrative through Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who disrupts linguistic unity by assigning different languages to the populations, complicating communication and challenging political negotiation. Cuneiform texts, including the Uruk copies of the epic, preserve variations in the story that emphasize both the pragmatic and symbolic consequences of this divine act. The account frames language as both a tool of authority and a mechanism through which divine power manifests in social and political domains. Analysis of the tablets indicates that the story functioned primarily as royal propaganda. Enmerkar's pursuit of tribute, temple construction, and urban expansion illustrates the idealized authority of kingship, linking human initiative to divine sanction. The disruption of language serves to highlight the king's dependence on divine favor, legitimizing his rule while reinforcing the primacy of cultic institutions in social cohesion. Archaeologists have noted the presence of administrative tablets associated with temple economies in Uruk, suggesting that the epic reflects contemporary concerns regarding labor mobilization, resource management, and ritual centrality. Linguistic and literary features of the epic reinforce its themes. Repetitive phrasing, structured dialogues, and mnemonic devices indicate its use in courtly recitation and ritual instruction. The story emphasizes the functional dimension of language in political and religious spheres, portraying it as central to governance, trade, and cultic coordination. By integrating divine intervention into the narrative, the epic conveys that linguistic plurality, while disruptive, is ultimately part of the cosmic order maintained by the gods. Comparative studies reveal striking parallels with the later Genesis 11 narrative. Both texts depict a single initial language, divine intervention, and subsequent linguistic differentiation. However, Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta situates the episode within royal and cultic frameworks, focusing on urban diplomacy, temple construction, and kingship rather than moral evaluation or ideological explanation. The Sumerian epic presents linguistic diversity as a tool of divine strategy, whereas Genesis emphasizes human ambition and theological causality. These distinctions demonstrate how the motif of a unified language and its disruption circulated across Mesopotamian literary traditions before being adapted into Hebrew scripture. Archaeological evidence from Uruk and surrounding sites corroborates the narrative's urban and cultic context. Excavations reveal monumental temple complexes, administrative archives, and craft production centers dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE. These material findings support the epic's depiction of city-based political authority and ritual centrality, showing that the text reflects real socio-political structures rather than abstract speculation. The preservation of the epic on multiple clay tablets suggests sustained interest in the story as a cultural and ideological reference point across generations. The epic also addresses the relationship between human and divine agency. Enmerkar's actions, demanding tribute, mobilizing labor, and constructing monumental architecture, illustrate the intersection of political ambition and ritual obligation. Enki's intervention by introducing linguistic multiplicity disrupts these plans, demonstrating that ultimate control resides with the gods. Cuneiform inscriptions and scholarly translations indicate that this intervention was not punitive but functional, reinforcing the narrative's emphasis on social hierarchy and divine oversight within Mesopotamian ideology. By presenting linguistic disruption within a political and religious framework, Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta situates human language as an instrument of both coordination and divine management. The story integrates administrative, ritual, and narrative elements, demonstrating that early Mesopotamian authors conceived of language as central to governance and cosmology. The epic's widespread circulation, as evidenced by multiple tablet copies, reflects its role in educating elites, legitimizing kingship, and transmitting cultural memory across city-states. Ultimately, the Sumerian epic demonstrates that the motif of a single language divided by divine intervention was present in Mesopotamian culture long before the composition of Genesis 11. It provides a historical and literary precedent for later Near Eastern accounts of linguistic unity and fragmentation. The narrative's integration of urban, political, and cultic elements shows that early literary traditions approached language not only as a means of communication but also as a symbol of authority and divine ordering. These ideas would later be reframed through different theological systems, influencing Hebrew narrative structures, the portrayal of human ambition, and the symbolic use of language in the Tower of Babel story. In Mesopotamia, the gods were distant but not threatened. Across a wide range of Sumerian and Akkadian texts, human ambition is consistently framed within divine limits. The Epic of Gilgamesh, composed in multiple versions from the early 2nd millennium BCE, illustrates the tension between human initiative and cosmic order. Gilgamesh's construction of Uruk's walls and temples demonstrates monumental achievement, yet divine oversight ensures that human action remains subordinate to the gods. Tablets from Nippur, Uar, and Nineveh preserve detailed descriptions of these constructions, highlighting their functional, civic, and ritual dimensions rather than portraying them as challenges to divine authority. Akkadian cosmological hymns reinforce this principle. Hymns addressed to Enlil, Anu, and Marduk describe the creation of human society, the establishment of cities, and the regulation of labor. These texts emphasize that humans may undertake large-scale urban projects and temple building, but their activities operate within divinely sanctioned parameters. Administrative tablets, including temple and palace archives, document the organization of labor and resources for construction projects, reflecting that monumental architecture was deeply integrated into religious and civic order. The textual and material evidence shows that humans acted as executors of divine will rather than competitors with it. Ziggurats, the characteristic step temples of Mesopotamia, exemplify this relationship. Excavations at Uar, Uruk, and Babylon reveal massive mud brick structures with elevated shrines at their summits. Archaeological analysis indicates that access to the upper terraces was restricted to priests and select officials, underlining the ritualized nature of the structure. The ziggurats served as a symbolic axis connecting the earthly and divine realms, yet it did not suggest human hubris. Inscriptions, dedicatory texts, and administrative records confirm that construction and maintenance were coordinated under temple oversight, reinforcing divine primacy in all civic and ceremonial matters. The Epic of Gilgamesh further illustrates the balance between human creativity and divine boundaries. While Gilgamesh erects monumental walls to protect Uruk, he is repeatedly reminded of mortality and divine limits. Tablets from the standard Babylonian version describe repeated interventions by the gods to regulate his actions, ensuring that human accomplishment does not equate to divine equivalence. Similarly, cosmological hymns outline the ordering of the cosmos, specifying roles for humans, cities, and deities in mutually defined hierarchies. Language describing divine oversight, ritual protocol, and sacred geography underscores the principle that human endeavor exists under established cosmic law. Historical records corroborate the practical integration of divine and civic authority. Temple archives from Uar and Lagash include detailed accounts of offerings, labor drafts, and construction schedules, all organized under the supervision of priests who represented divine interests. The coordination of agricultural, craft, and labor resources for urban projects was governed by the temple rather than autonomous secular ambition. Archaeological evidence, including foundation deposits and inscribed bricks, demonstrates that monumental construction was both a civic achievement and a religious duty, legitimized and controlled by the gods. Administrative and literary texts converge on a consistent theme. Humans may construct, plan, and organize, but ultimate authority resides with the divine. The Epic of Gilgamesh, hymns to Marduk, and inscriptions describing ziggurat projects all illustrate that human initiative was valued for practical and ritual purposes, but was inherently subordinate to divine order. These sources reveal that Mesopotamian cosmology conceptualized hierarchical balance, not conflict between mortals and deities. Monumental architecture expressed devotion, facilitated governance, and reflected cosmic principles rather than ambition in opposition to the divine. This framework provides context for understanding why later Hebrew narratives reinterpret the motif. Unlike Mesopotamian tradition, which assumes human activity operates within divinely sanctioned limits, Genesis 11 presents the tower builder's ambition as an ethical and theological concern. By contrast with the Epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical narrative emphasizes the human impulse to make a name and frames divine action as corrective. The Mesopotamian precedent establishes that monumental construction alone was never regarded as hubris, clarifying that the Babel story represents a reframing of urban achievement into a narrative of moral and linguistic significance. By examining textual, archaeological, and administrative sources, it is clear that Mesopotamian society conceptualized divine boundaries as absolute and effective. Humans could build, govern, and administer complex urban centers, but their authority derived from and remained subordinate to divine sanction. The structural, ritual, and narrative systems preserved across multiple cities demonstrate that monumental projects, including ziggurats, were never inherently threatening to the gods. They were integrated into the fabric of religious, civic, and cosmological order. This contrast becomes central to the biblical transformation of the tower motif, as Genesis reframes human construction from a routine expression of civic and cultic practice into a theologically charged narrative emphasizing divine authority, human ambition, and linguistic differentiation. Myths rarely travel intact, they adapt. In the ancient Near East, cultural narratives circulated widely through trade, diplomacy, conquest, and exile, allowing motifs to migrate across languages, city-states, and empires. Archaeological evidence from urban centers such as Babylon, Nippur, and Uruk demonstrates that scribal schools maintained libraries of cuneiform tablets containing literary, administrative, and cultic texts. These institutions preserved canonical versions of epics, hymns, and legal documents, which could be transmitted beyond their original cultural and linguistic contexts. Such movement established networks of intellectual exchange that facilitated the diffusion of ideas about urbanism, divine human interaction, and linguistic unity. The Babylonian exile, 597 to 538 BCE, was a particularly significant moment in this process. Exiled communities from Judah encountered Neo-Babylonian institutions directly, including monumental architecture, religious rituals, and administrative systems. Archaeological excavations of Babylonian archives reveal records of temple administration, urban planning, and scribal training, demonstrating sustained cultural and educational contact. Exiles likely observed the functioning of ziggurats, the use of cuneiform as administrative and religious communication, and the integration of labor organization with cultic oversight. These experiences provided raw material for subsequent literary and theological adaptation in Hebrew texts. Textual evidence supports the mechanism of transmission. Comparative studies of Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hebrew literary corpora indicate shared motifs, including linguistic unity, divine intervention, and the moral evaluation of human initiative. The Sumerian epic in Merkur and the Lord of Errata and Akkadian cosmological hymns circulated in copies that could have been accessible to scribes in Babylonian exilic communities. Such texts contain narrative frameworks and motifs parallel to those later codified in Genesis 11, including the centrality of urban construction, divine oversight, and the consequences of human ambition. Literary adaptation allowed these motifs to be recontextualized in a new theological and cultural framework while preserving recognizable structural elements. Archaeology confirms the presence of intercultural textual interaction. Excavated libraries at sites such as Sippar and Uruk reveal bilingual and multilingual inscriptions, including Sumerian-Akkadian lexical lists and scribal exercise tablets. These materials demonstrate that scribes were trained to work across linguistic boundaries, translating, copying, and interpreting texts for administrative, cultic, and educational purposes. This environment of linguistic fluidity provided both the technical means and the cognitive framework for integrating foreign narrative motifs into local literary traditions. The process ensured that while core themes persisted, adaptation to local theology, social structure, and historical memory was inevitable. The movement of myths was further facilitated by political and economic networks. Babylonian administrative correspondence and diplomatic letters show extensive contact with Levantine polities. These records document trade missions, tribute collection, and interregional communication, which transmitted not only goods but also ideas about governance, ritual, and urban symbolism. Texts carried across these channels, through scribal copying, oral transmission, and intercultural collaboration, enabled motifs such as centralized urban authority, monumental construction, and divine oversight to enter new cultural and linguistic domains. The Hebrew adaptation of these motifs illustrates selective integration. In Genesis 11, the narrative condenses multiple elements from Mesopotamian sources, emphasizing theological points relevant to exilic communities. Language, urban ambition, and divine action are reframed to communicate moral and religious lessons rather than to document historical reality. Whereas Mesopotamian texts often depict linguistic disruption as functional or symbolic within social and political hierarchies, the Hebrew narrative emphasizes ethical evaluation and divine sovereignty. This transformation demonstrates the creative process of adaptation. Borrowed motifs are not reproduced wholesale but reshaped to address local concerns, cultural memory, and theological priorities. Archaeological and textual evidence together demonstrate the durability of mythic motifs across time and space. Tablet libraries, scribal schools, and diplomatic correspondence maintained continuity of narrative elements even as cultural context changed. The process ensured that myths such as those about linguistic unity, monumental towers, and divine intervention could survive multiple generations, while gradually evolving to reflect the priorities of new communities. Genesis 11 exemplifies this phenomenon, preserving recognizable Near Eastern elements within a distinctly Hebrew literary and theological framework. By tracing the movement of these motifs, it becomes clear that the Babel story belongs to a wider Near Eastern intellectual tradition rather than arising in isolation. The narrative is part of a continuum of literary and cultural exchange that spans centuries, integrating political, religious, and urbanist experiences from Mesopotamia into Hebrew scripture. Archaeology and textual analysis together demonstrate that the story is both locally adapted and regionally informed, reflecting sustained intercultural contact and intellectual engagement. This adaptation becomes visible when archaeology confronts textual memory, allowing historians to correlate material evidence, urban centers, monumental architecture, and administrative systems, with the literary motifs preserved in biblical narratives such as the Tower of Babel, Eno ruin in Babylon records a divine catastrophe. Archaeological investigation of Babylon, spanning the 19th century through contemporary Iraqi research, provides detailed insight into the city's urban layout, monumental structures, and material culture, yet offers no evidence supporting a sudden destruction consistent with the Genesis 11 account. Excavations led by Robert Coldway in the early 20th century, alongside more recent fieldwork, focused on the city's ziggurat precinct, palaces, and fortifications. Special attention has been given to Edamananke, the great temple tower traditionally associated with the Tower of Babel narrative. Coldway's excavation revealed the multi-phase construction of Edamananke, consisting of successive layers of mud brick and baked brick foundations. Inscriptions from Nebuchadnezzar II indicate repeated restorations, maintenance programs, and ceremonial dedications. These records show that the ziggurat functioned as a long-term cultic center rather than a one-time construction destroyed by divine intervention. Clay tablets recovered from the site document labor mobilization, brick production, and administrative oversight, providing evidence of continuous human management rather than catastrophic abandonment. Archaeological stratigraphy corroborates these textual findings, demonstrating gradual deposition and reconstruction rather than abrupt collapse. Further examination of urban layers across Babylon supports this picture of continuity. Excavated streets, residential areas, and administrative complexes show evidence of persistent occupation from the Old Babylonian period through the Neo-Babylonian and Persian eras. While sections of the city were rebuilt or renovated due to natural decay or political restructuring, no horizon indicates a sudden, widespread abandonment of the scale implied in the biblical narrative. Even after the city's eventual decline in the Hellenistic and Parthian periods, the material record demonstrates a gradual reduction of urban activity rather than dramatic catastrophe. Inscriptions and administrative records also reveal the practical management of monumental architecture over centuries. Babylonian texts describe coordinated maintenance of ziggurats, including regular brick replacement, ritual dedications, and temple administration. Foundation deposits and dedicatory bricks, many of which remain in situ, confirm that Edamananke underwent repeated interventions to preserve structural integrity. These inscriptions indicate that the ziggurat retained religious and civic significance well beyond the periods traditionally associated with the biblical narrative. Archaeological methods further clarify the city's long-term use. Stratigraphic analysis, radiocarbon dating, and ceramic typology allow precise reconstruction of occupational sequences. These methods confirm continuity in urban settlement and temple activity across centuries. Excavators have noted that while monumental towers required substantial maintenance, repairs were systematic and planned, suggesting that the collapse depicted in the Genesis account is symbolic rather than historical. The absence of destruction layers highlights the difference between literary representation and archaeological reality. Material culture, including domestic pottery, administrative seals, and tools, supports the interpretation of gradual urban evolution. Objects from both elite and common contexts show continuity of style, function, and production methods, indicating stable habitation. Archaeological surveys outside the ziggurat precinct reveal extensive urban sprawl, trade networks, and infrastructural maintenance. These findings reinforce the conclusion that Babylon's monumental core, including Edamananke, remained in sustained use rather than undergoing sudden, catastrophic ruin. The disparity between archaeological evidence and textual narrative underscores the symbolic function of Genesis 11. While the biblical story presents linguistic confusion and urban dispersion as divine acts, the material record indicates that Babylonian urban life operated under long-term human management. By combining stratigraphic data, inscriptions, and material culture, archaeology demonstrates that the collapse described in biblical memory was not a physical event, but a literary and theological construction. This distinction is essential for understanding the Tower of Babel as a narrative shaped by memory, theology, and cultural reinterpretation rather than literal historical reportage. In sum, excavations of Babylon provide comprehensive documentation of urban continuity, monumental maintenance, and administrative oversight. No physical layer corresponds to sudden destruction, abandonment, or divine intervention. Inscriptions, stratigraphy, and material culture collectively depict Edamananke as a continuously managed religious structure, embedded within a city that evolved over centuries. The archaeological record clarifies the limits of material evidence in verifying literary narratives, illustrating the need to interpret Genesis 11 within symbolic, theological, and cultural frameworks rather than as empirical history. Interpretation filled the gap where material evidence remained silent, allowing biblical authors and later traditions to construct a narrative of linguistic division and divine judgment that resonated with theological, moral, and cultural concerns. When ruins fade, imagination expands. Following Babylon's gradual decline, later societies sought to reconstruct the Tower of Babel both visually and conceptually. Classical authors such as Herodotus and later Roman historians describe the city and its monumental architecture, often relying on second-hand reports or symbolic interpretation rather than first-hand observation. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, provides accounts of Babylonian walls, gates, and ziggurats, noting scale and grandeur, while occasionally incorporating anecdotal or legendary elements. These early narratives set the stage for a long tradition of imaginative reconstructions that would continue into medieval Europe and the Renaissance. Medieval scholarship and iconography further amplified the tower's scale and significance. Christian exegetes, influenced by the Vulgate translation of Genesis, depicted Babel as an immense, spiraling edifice reaching into the heavens. Manuscript illuminations and architectural sketches exaggerated verticality, reflecting theological concerns about human pride and divine authority. The tower became a visual shorthand for collective ambition, linguistic division, and moral instruction. Across diverse contexts, from monastic manuscripts to public sermons, the image of Babel was shaped less by archaeological observation and more by symbolic and didactic priorities. These reconstructions demonstrate a key distinction between material evidence and cultural memory. Archaeological excavations in Babylon reveal foundations, brick layers, and inscriptions that document repeated maintenance and ceremonial use. There is no indication of the sudden collapse or catastrophic dispersal described in biblical narrative. In contrast, textual and visual traditions emphasize drama, height, and moral significance. The tower's imagined dimensions and functions were often amplified to convey theological lessons, transforming a material monument into a conceptual icon. Classical and medieval sources also contributed to a cumulative distortion of scale. Writers like Josephus in the 1st century CE reported Etemenanke's height as surpassing 70 meters, while medieval architects and illustrators imagined structures reaching the clouds. These accounts relied on prior descriptions, literary embellishment, and analogical reasoning rather than empirical measurement. The persistence of these interpretations demonstrates how societies reconstruct memory based on narrative and ideology, filling gaps left by incomplete archaeological knowledge with imagination, moral allegory, and aesthetic elaboration. Archaeological and textual comparison clarifies this distinction. Excavations conducted by Robert Coldway in the early 20th century, and more recent surveys, confirmed that Etemenanke's surviving foundations corresponded to a multi-tiered ziggurat roughly 91 meters on the base with a height of perhaps 55 meters, far smaller than medieval depictions. Inscriptions indicate that the structure's primary function was cultic, serving as the temple platform for Marduk and other deities, rather than as a tower symbolizing human defiance. This material evidence underscores the difference between historical architecture and collective memory, showing that reconstruction often prioritized narrative meaning over empirical accuracy. The process of reconstructing Babel also extended to linguistic and literary interpretation. Jewish, Christian, and later Islamic commentators treated the tower as a vehicle for exploring human ambition, divine authority, and the origin of languages. Each interpretive tradition amplified the tower's symbolic dimensions, often projecting contemporary concerns onto an ancient site. Architectural imagination, literary exegesis, and theological reflection combined to create a cumulative cultural memory of Babel that eclipsed the archaeological record. Tablets, inscriptions, and structural remains provided only the framework. Interpretation supplied the narrative substance. Moreover, artistic reconstructions were shaped by broader intellectual currents. Renaissance humanists, studying classical texts, emphasized proportion, perspective, and monumental scale, embedding the tower within a cosmological and moral framework. Illustrations by artists such as Peter Bruegel the Elder present the tower as an immense, spiraling structure with thousands of workers, dramatizing human effort and divine oversight. These visualizations reflect the adaptation of ancient memory to contemporary aesthetic, cultural, and moral contexts, rather than faithful documentation of Etemenanke's actual dimensions or design. The contrast between archaeological reality and imaginative reconstruction highlights the enduring power of cultural memory. While excavations provide precise information on brick size, construction phases, and maintenance, narrative traditions preserve symbolic meaning, transmitting ideas about divine human interaction, linguistic diversity, and moral accountability. Cultural memory, reinforced through literature, art, and religious commentary, shapes public understanding of the past, often independent of material evidence. This dual process, archaeological verification and imaginative elaboration, demonstrates how historical monuments become cultural icons. In conclusion, the reconstruction of Babel illustrates the interaction between memory, imagination, and material evidence. Archaeology documents the physical monument and its continuous use, while textual and visual traditions expand, reinterpret, and moralize its significance. Across classical, medieval, and early modern contexts, the tower became a symbol of human ambition constrained by divine authority. By distinguishing between material fact and reconstructed memory, scholars can trace how the Tower of Babel transitioned from historical ziggurat to enduring theological and cultural motif. These reconstructions shaped later theological readings, providing the framework through which the tower motif would influence biblical interpretation, exilic reflection, and subsequent literary, artistic, and cultural traditions. Babel changed meaning once it was unearthed. The emergence of modern archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly through the field of Assyriology, transformed scholarly approaches to Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel narrative. Excavations at Babylon, Nineveh, and other Mesopotamian cities provided direct access to monumental architecture, cuneiform archives, and urban organization, revealing a complex urban and religious environment. Scholars realized that material culture did not support the notion of a sudden collapse or divine intervention as described in the biblical text. This evidence shifted interpretation from historical reportage toward theological and literary analysis. Pioneering excavators such as Austin Henry Layard, Hormizd Rassam, and Robert Coldway uncovered temples, palaces, and administrative archives that clarified Babylonian history and urban development. Their findings included the foundations of Edamananke, inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar II, and detailed accounts of ziggurat maintenance. These discoveries demonstrated continuity in construction and occupation, showing that the ziggurat was a functioning religious and administrative center rather than a monument destroyed by divine judgment. Scholars contrasted these empirical observations with the biblical narrative, noting that Genesis 11 should be read as symbolic literature, reflecting moral and theological concerns rather than a historical chronicle. The development of Assyriology as a formal discipline facilitated rigorous textual and archaeological comparison. Transliteration and translation of cuneiform tablets allowed scholars to access legal codes, hymns, epics, and administrative records. Comparative studies revealed motifs in Sumerian and Akkadian literature, including the disruption of linguistic unity, divine oversight of monumental construction, and the ordering of human society. Recognition of these parallels underscored that the Babel story was part of a wider Near Eastern intellectual milieu. Archaeology thus provided context, showing that biblical authors adapted, reframed, and interpreted Mesopotamian motifs rather than recording first-hand historical events. Critical biblical scholarship further integrated these insights. The rise of source criticism in the 19th century identified multiple compositional strands within the Pentateuch, situating Genesis 11 within the priestly and Yahwist traditions. Analysis of language, style, and narrative structure suggested that the text was composed or redacted during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, likely reflecting the experiences and concerns of displaced communities. Archaeological evidence from Babylon and surrounding regions corroborated the cultural and urban realities encountered by these exiles, reinforcing the understanding of Genesis 11 as theological literature, responding to historical circumstances rather than literal history. Scholars also examined the narrative's symbolic functions in light of archaeological findings. Linguistic unity, urban construction, and divine intervention were interpreted as literary devices conveying moral and theological messages. The absence of a destruction layer at Edamananke and the continuous occupation of Babylonian cities demonstrated that the biblical account did not record a physical catastrophe. Instead, Genesis 11 employed the tower motif to explore themes of human pride, divine authority, and social differentiation, transforming concrete urban experience into moral narrative. The integration of archaeology with textual criticism produced methodological advances. Scholars could now correlate material evidence, literary motifs, and historical context, establishing a framework for understanding biblical texts as culturally and theologically situated. Excavations confirmed the historical plausibility of urban grandeur, monumental ziggurats, and centralized administration, while simultaneously demonstrating that the dramatic collapse described in Genesis was narrative construction. This dual perspective allowed for a nuanced reading of the Tower of Babel. The story reflects both collective memory of Mesopotamian urbanism and the theological reinterpretation of human ambition and linguistic diversity. By the mid-20th century, Assyriological and biblical scholarship converged on a critical consensus. Genesis 11 is not a literal record of events but a theological and literary work informed by Mesopotamian culture, exile experience, and narrative tradition. Archaeological discoveries provided empirical grounding, while textual analysis illuminated literary strategy, symbolism, and theological intent. This approach underscored the distinction between historical reality and narrative memory, demonstrating how the Tower of Babel evolved from a Mesopotamian ziggurat into a universal symbol of human ambition and divine sovereignty. In summary, modern archaeology and biblical criticism reveal that the Tower of Babel is a product of literary adaptation, theological reflection, and cultural memory. Excavation of Babylon clarified the scale, function, and longevity of Enki, contradicting any literal reading of divine destruction. Simultaneously, textual and comparative analysis situated Genesis 11 within the intellectual and political context of the Near East, particularly the Babylonian exile. Together, these disciplines transformed scholarly understanding of Babel from historical literalism to nuanced interpretation. To Greek historians, the tower was architecture, not warning. Classical authors who visited or described Babylon approached its monuments from a practical, observational standpoint, emphasizing scale, engineering, and cultural context rather than moral or theological lessons. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, provides one of the earliest detailed accounts of Babylon, including its walls, gates, canals, and temples. He notes the grandeur of the ziggurat, its layered construction, and the elaborate urban layout, yet he makes no reference to divine judgment or linguistic disruption. For Greek observers, Babylon's monuments exemplified civic ambition and engineering skill rather than a narrative of human hubris. Strabo, writing in the 1st century CE, further reinforces this perspective. In his geography, he describes Babylon's structures and waterways, focusing on their material composition, dimensions, and urban function. He mentions the ziggurat known as Enki, detailing its successive tiers and its role as a temple platform for Marduk. Like Herodotus, Strabo does not connect the tower with any story of linguistic confusion or divine punishment. Roman authors, including Tacitus and Pliny the Elder, largely followed these descriptive approaches, reporting Babylon's impressive walls, monumental gates, and public works. Their accounts preserve knowledge of urban grandeur without integrating theological interpretation. Archaeological evidence confirms the classical focus on materiality. Foundations uncovered during excavations at Babylon correspond closely with descriptions of massive mud-brick terraces, wide staircases, and administrative precincts. Classical observers had access to functioning remnants of these structures or their near-continuous use, enabling practical observation rather than interpretive speculation. Greek and Roman travelogues, diplomatic records, and administrative reports indicate interest in measurements, construction techniques, and civic organization, highlighting a historiographical tradition grounded in empirical observation. The divergence between classical and Hebrew perspectives is significant. While Greek and Roman authors emphasized architectural achievement and urban complexity, Jewish writers during and after the Babylonian exile recast these same monuments within a theological and moral framework. The Tower of Babel narrative interprets Enki not merely as a physical structure, but as a symbol of human ambition, divine oversight, and linguistic division. The contrast illustrates how identical urban phenomena were understood differently depending on cultural, religious, and historical context. Greek and Roman descriptions also illuminate the continuity of Babylonian urban life. Classical texts often record temple repairs, civic administration, and the persistence of cultic activity, aligning with archaeological evidence of sustained occupation and maintenance. Authors commented on the city's capacity to mobilize labor and manage resources efficiently, reflecting appreciation of institutional complexity rather than anxiety over moral transgression. Their accounts preserve information about daily life, ceremonial practices, and the integration of monumental architecture into civic organization. Material observations recorded by classical authors occasionally include numerical estimates, such as Herodotus' claim that the walls were wide enough for a four-horse chariot. Although these figures are sometimes exaggerated, they demonstrate attention to measurable, observable phenomena rather than theological reflection. Similarly, descriptions of canals, gates, and palaces provide insight into hydraulic engineering, defensive strategy, and urban planning. By prioritizing physicality and functionality, Greek and Roman writers contributed to a historiography of Babylon that contrasted sharply with the moralized interpretation emerging in Jewish tradition. The absence of linguistic or ethical commentary in classical sources emphasizes the cultural specificity of the Tower of Babel motif. For Greeks and Romans, Babylon's monumental structures were impressive but comprehensible within human and technological terms. They did not perceive divine retribution encoded in architectural scale or urban planning. In contrast, Jewish exilic writers transformed physical monuments into symbols, integrating memory, theology, and narrative construction. This contrast highlights the role of perspective in historical interpretation. Identical artifacts can acquire distinct meaning depending on the observer's cultural framework, intellectual priorities, and religious assumptions. In conclusion, Greek and Roman accounts present Babylon primarily as an architectural and urban phenomenon. Herodotus, Strabo, and other classical authors describe scale, construction, and civic organization, emphasizing observation and empirical reporting rather than theological judgment. Archaeological evidence corroborates these descriptions, revealing maintained ziggurats, administrative precincts, and temple complexes. The classical perspective demonstrates that the Tower of Babel's moralized and linguistic elements were not universally recognized, underscoring the diversity of interpretive traditions surrounding Babylon and its monuments. Jewish writers offered a different interpretation, transforming Babylonian architecture into a moral and theological symbol, and establishing the foundations for subsequent biblical and post-biblical readings of the Tower motif. Babel became a lesson in power. During the Second Temple period, Jewish interpreters reimagined the Genesis 11 narrative in ways that emphasized human ambition, political authority, and divine judgment. Flavius Josephus, writing in the late 1st century CE, provides the most extensive surviving account. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus identifies Nimrod as the central figure behind the construction of the tower, portraying him as a rebellious, tyrannical ruler who sought to consolidate political and religious authority. The narrative frames Babel not merely as an architectural project, but as an expression of human arrogance in defiance of divine order. Josephus situates the tower within a broader historical theological context. He interprets the Genesis account as reflecting universal human tendencies toward centralized power, collective pride, and resistance to God's will. By attributing leadership to Nimrod, Josephus introduces a political dimension absent from the canonical Hebrew text, linking urban expansion, monumental construction, and authoritarian governance. The narrative merges historical memory of Mesopotamian urbanism with moral and theological instruction, demonstrating how Second Temple Judaism expanded and elaborated upon the original biblical story. Textual evidence from other Second Temple literature supports this interpretive expansion. Apocryphal works and pseudepigraphal writings occasionally reference Babel or Nimrod indirectly, highlighting themes of human overreach, divine intervention, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. These texts illustrate a pattern of reinterpretation. The tower becomes both a narrative device and a symbol for political and ethical discourse. The integration of historical, legendary, and theological elements reflects the concerns of exilic and post-exilic communities grappling with questions of power, obedience, and cultural identity. Archaeological context reinforces the plausibility of these reinterpretations. Excavations at Babylon reveal monumental structures, urban density, and administrative complexity consistent with Josephus' characterization of ambitious urban leaders. While there is no archaeological evidence linking Nimrod to Etemenanke or to the supposed linguistic catastrophe, the city's scale and organization provided a tangible model for literary elaboration. Scribes and interpreters could draw upon collective memory of Mesopotamian cities to create a narrative that communicated both historical familiarity and theological insight. Josephus' treatment of Babel also exemplifies a broader trend in Second Temple Jewish exegesis, the moralization of historical memory. The narrative emphasizes that human action, even when supported by technological skill or social organization, remains subordinate to divine authority. Architectural achievement and centralized urban administration are interpreted through the lens of divine oversight. The story conveys the ethical message that political ambition, when divorced from obedience to God, incurs corrective consequences, embodied in the dispersal of peoples and the confusion of languages. Comparative textual analysis demonstrates how Josephus' interpretation builds upon earlier traditions. The Genesis account, Mesopotamian myths such as Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta, and the cosmological motifs of ziggurats converge in his narrative. Josephus synthesizes these elements into a coherent historical-theological framework, transforming the tower from a symbolic architectural monument into a cautionary tale about leadership, rebellion, and divine judgment. This process illustrates the interplay between historical memory, literary adaptation, and religious pedagogy in Second Temple Judaism. The reinterpretation of Babel also serves a social function. By framing Nimrod as a tyrannical figure, Josephus reinforces communal boundaries and ethical norms for Jewish audiences in the Roman world. The narrative communicates the dangers of collective hubris and the necessity of fidelity to divine authority, addressing contemporary concerns about imperial power, social cohesion, and cultural identity. The story becomes a vehicle for reflection on human governance, divine sovereignty, and the moral ordering of society. In conclusion, Josephus' account exemplifies the Second Temple expansion of the Babel narrative. By introducing Nimrod as a central figure of political ambition and framing the construction of the tower as an act of defiance, he embeds theological, political, and moral instruction within historical memory. The narrative integrates Mesopotamian urban models, biblical tradition, and interpretive elaboration, transforming Babel from a geographical landmark into a universal symbol of human pride and divine oversight. Babel and Pentecost were read as opposites. In early Christian exegesis, the Tower of Babel assumed a moral and spiritual significance that diverged from historical or architectural concerns. Church fathers, most notably Augustine of Hippo, interpreted the narrative as the theological inverse of the Pentecost event described in Acts 2. While Babel represented the fragmentation of human language and the dispersal of communities as a consequence of pride and disobedience, Pentecost signified the restoration of divine communication and ecclesiastical unity through the gift of the Holy Spirit. In this framework, language became a category of spiritual and moral order rather than a record of historical events. Patristic commentaries frequently emphasized human pride, divine judgment, and the ethical consequences of collective ambition. Augustine, in The City of God, argues that Babel illustrates the disorder inherent in human societies unaligned with God's will. The dispersion of languages symbolized the consequences of sin and social disunity, reinforcing the need for divine guidance and moral rectitude. Early Christian writers extended this interpretation, treating the story as a didactic model for understanding the relationship between human endeavor, moral law, and spiritual authority. These theological readings were supported by textual tradition and cultural memory rather than empirical observation. The Church Fathers relied on Hebrew scripture, Greek translations, and earlier Jewish commentaries, particularly Josephus, to construct an interpretive framework. The focus shifted from material monuments, such as Etemenanke, to narrative and moral symbolism. Babel became a paradigm for the dangers of collective ambition, the limits of human autonomy, and the divine ordering of language, society, and worship. The comparative function of Babel and Pentecost was central to early Christian thought. Babel represented human failure, disorder, and the multiplicity of tongues. Pentecost represented divine intervention, unity, and spiritual communication. This dialectical relationship allowed theologians to frame historical and moral lessons in terms of cosmic and ecclesiastical significance. Language was no longer merely a practical tool for communication. It became a measure of spiritual alignment, communal cohesion, and moral responsibility. The Tower of Babel, therefore, was read as a moral architecture rather than a literal construction. Patristic sources also illustrate how cultural and artistic representations reinforced theological readings. In manuscripts, illuminated psalters, and biblical commentaries, the tower is frequently depicted as a spiraling structure, crowded with figures, emphasizing human labor and disorder. These images served as visual reinforcement of moral and theological points, creating an enduring association between architecture, sin, and divine order. The illustrations are not accurate records of Babylonian construction but visualizations of ethical and spiritual lessons. This theological focus influenced preaching, liturgy, and pedagogy throughout the early Christian world. Babel narratives were used to teach about human pride, social division, and the necessity of obedience to God. By framing the tower in spiritual terms, early Christian authors provided their audiences with a paradigm for understanding human communities, authority, and divine oversight. The narrative thus operated as a vehicle for instruction, integrating moral, linguistic, and communal dimensions into a coherent interpretive schema. In conclusion, early Christian theology redefined Babel as a moral and spiritual symbol, contrasting the fragmentation of human language with the unifying effect of Pentecost. Church fathers such as Augustine transformed the story from historical memory into an ethical and theological tool, emphasizing divine sovereignty, human limitation, and moral consequence. Material monuments like Edamananke became secondary to narrative symbolism, and language itself assumed moral and spiritual significance. This interpretive shift reinforced the tower's role as a didactic device, shaping the reception of Babel throughout medieval Europe and beyond. These interpretations shaped medieval worldviews, informing scholastic commentary, manuscript illustration, and the broader cultural imagination surrounding the Tower of Babel. Babel crossed into Islam without its tower. The Quran references the dispersion of peoples and divine authority over human pride, although it does not provide a detailed architectural description of the tower itself. Classical Islamic exegetically literature, or tafsir, often identifies Nimrod, Arabic, Namrud, as the central figure associated with defiance against God, reflecting earlier Jewish and biblical traditions. The Quranic narrative emphasizes the moral and theological dimensions of human ambition, framing linguistic plurality and political disorder as consequences of rebellion rather than focusing on monumental architecture. Tafsir literature from the early Abbasid period provides interpretive expansions on the brief Quranic account. Scholars such as Al-Tabari and Al-Qurtubi contextualize Nimrod's actions within broader moral and historical frameworks, linking the narrative to themes of tyrannical governance, divine sovereignty, and the limits of human authority. Geographic localization is occasionally addressed, with Babylon or Mesopotamian plains serving as the plausible setting, yet the emphasis remains on ethical and spiritual lessons rather than empirical topography or precise architectural reconstruction. Islamic historiography and literary sources also incorporate the Babel narrative into accounts of human civilization, drawing on interactions with Jewish and Christian traditions. The story of Nimrod and his challenge to the prophet Abraham often serves as a moral exemplar, illustrating the consequences of arrogance and disobedience. These narratives integrate linguistic and political disruption with divine instruction, reinforcing the theological interpretation that guided exegesis, preaching, and legal reflection in Islamic scholarship. Classical and medieval Islamic scholars were aware of Babylonian urban and monumental structures through contact with historical records, travelers' accounts, and shared Near Eastern knowledge. While archaeological observation was limited compared to modern standards, textual memory of ziggurats, palaces, and city walls informed the narrative backdrop. The emphasis, however, remained symbolic. The tower functions as a didactic motif highlighting the moral and social consequences of rebellion against divine authority, rather than as a literal architectural phenomenon. The narrative also underscores continuity with earlier traditions while accommodating distinctive Islamic theological concerns. Language and governance serve as instruments of moral instruction, illustrating the proper ordering of society and the consequences of pride. Quranic interpretation often frames the event as a cautionary tale for rulers and communities, emphasizing divine oversight and human limitation. The story's integration into Islamic jurisprudence, moral philosophy, and historiography reflects its broader applicability beyond strictly scriptural exegesis. Moreover, Islamic visual and literary culture contributed to the symbolic representation of Babel. While depictions of the tower are less common than in European manuscripts, literary descriptions in Persian, Arabic, and Ottoman chronicles retain elements of monumental ambition, collective labor, and divine consequence. These accounts continue the process of reinterpretation, situating the tower within a moralized urban imaginary while maintaining continuity with Mesopotamian urban memory. In conclusion, Islamic traditions preserve the narrative of Babel as a moral and theological exemplar rather than a historical or architectural record. Quranic references, tafsir commentary, and historical literature emphasize divine authority, linguistic plurality, and human ambition, while occasionally engaging with geographic and cultural memory. The story of Nimrod integrates ethical instruction, historical continuity, and symbolic meaning, demonstrating the cross-cultural transmission and reinterpretation of the Babel motif within a distinctly Islamic framework. Medieval Europe developed parallel interpretations, blending biblical exegesis, classical knowledge, and imaginative reconstruction to produce richly visual and symbolic accounts of Babel. Language became a map of humanity. In medieval Europe, the Tower of Babel was central to understanding ethnic diversity, human settlement, and world geography. Chroniclers and scholars interpreted Genesis 11 as an ideological explanation for the dispersion of peoples and the origin of different languages. This interpretation informed the design of mappamundi, world maps that visually integrated biblical history, geography, and cosmology. On these maps, Babel was frequently depicted as the point from which human populations radiated across the continents, with rivers, cities, and mountain ranges serving as visual markers of linguistic and cultural differentiation. Medieval encyclopedias and chronicles, such as the Speculum Historiale of Vincent of Beauvais, often describe Babel as both a historical and moral landmark. Authors emphasized that the multiplication of languages was a divine measure to regulate human pride, providing a framework for understanding the organization of nations and rulers. These texts consistently combined biblical exegesis with classical geographic knowledge, incorporating reports from travelers, earlier historians, and local traditions. The result was a conceptual world in which linguistic diversity became a mechanism for mapping social and political order. Manuscript illumination further reinforced these cosmological interpretations. Illustrations often depict the tower as a massive, spiraling structure from which figures descend, signifying the scattering of peoples. Such visualizations integrate moral teaching, historical memory, and geographic knowledge, transforming the biblical story into a didactic tool for both literacy and moral instruction. The tower becomes both a narrative and cartographic reference point, bridging textual exegesis and visual imagination in medieval scholarly practice. Scholars of the period also employed the Babel narrative to explain contemporary linguistic and ethnic observations. In mappamundi, regions with distinct languages or customs were traced back to the dispersal from the tower, linking biblical history to real-world geography. Chroniclers interpreted place names, trade routes, and settlement patterns as evidence of this process, often combining inherited knowledge from Greco-Roman sources with biblical tradition. This framework provided a comprehensive worldview that integrated theology, ethnography, and natural history. Theological commentary emphasized moral as well as geographic implications. Babel symbolized human pride and divine regulation, offering lessons for rulers, clerics, and lay audiences. By associating linguistic plurality with divine judgment, scholars conveyed the limits of political ambition, the consequences of disobedience, and the necessity of social and religious order. The narrative provided a unifying framework for understanding historical causation, linguistic diversity, and the ethical organization of human society. Artistic depictions of Babel in stained glass, frescoes, and illuminated manuscripts further reinforced its role in medieval cosmology. These images often exaggerate verticality and collective labor, emphasizing both monumental ambition and divine intervention. By integrating architecture, human activity, and geographic dispersion, the illustrations visually encode the theological and historical interpretation of the story, embedding Babel into the medieval intellectual imagination. The tower functions as a mnemonic and instructional device, linking scriptural narrative to everyday moral and educational contexts. In addition, medieval scholarship continued to incorporate classical and Near Eastern sources. Texts such as Josephus' Antiquities and Herodotus' accounts were synthesized with biblical exegesis, providing historical texture and comparative perspective. These sources informed the conceptualization of Babylon and the Tower, even as the emphasis shifted to moral, cosmological, and geographic meaning rather than empirical history. The interplay between inherited knowledge and interpretive imagination demonstrates how the Babel story was adapted to suit pedagogical, religious, and cultural needs. In conclusion, medieval Christian cosmology transformed the Tower of Babel into a central explanatory device for ethnic, linguistic, and geographic diversity. Chroniclers, mapmakers, and theologians combined biblical narrative, classical reports, and imaginative reconstruction to create a coherent framework linking divine action to human settlement. On Mappamundi and in Chronicles, Babel functioned as both historical anchor and moral exemplar, illustrating the interconnectedness of language, geography, and social order in the medieval worldview. These ideas persisted into early modern scholarship, influencing Renaissance humanists, cartographers, and natural historians who continued to reconcile biblical narrative with empirical observation and classical learning. Babel was rebuilt on canvas. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, the Tower of Babel was not only interpreted through text but also visualized through art and architecture, reflecting contemporary moral, cosmological, and aesthetic concerns. Illuminated manuscripts, fresco cycles, and oil paintings presented the tower as a monumental, spiraling structure, emphasizing human ambition, collective labor, and divine oversight. Artists drew on biblical narrative, classical descriptions, and imaginative reconstruction to create representations that communicated theological, historical, and social lessons to literate and visual audiences alike. One of the most studied examples is Peter Bruegel the Elder's 1563 oil painting, which depicts the tower as an immense, unfinished spiral dominating the landscape. Bruegel emphasizes architectural complexity, dense human activity, and vertical scale, integrating both Northern Renaissance attention to detail and classical perspectives on urban form. While not historically accurate to Edominanke or Mesopotamian construction methods, the painting conveys moral and cultural meaning. It symbolizes human pride, disobedience, and the limits of collective enterprise. Architectural exaggeration, scale, and perspective were deliberately employed to instruct viewers on the consequences of hubris. Earlier medieval manuscripts and frescoes, including examples from monastic scriptoria and cathedral cycles, similarly portray the tower as a vast, ascending structure, frequently crowded with workers. These illustrations reflect both pedagogical and moralizing intent. The tower's verticality serves as a visual metaphor for human ambition, while the presence of divine figures or symbols conveys oversight and ultimate judgment. The integration of architectural imagination and theological commentary demonstrates how visual culture mediated scriptural interpretation, complementing textual exegesis and reinforcing cosmological and moral frameworks. Architectural knowledge of the time also influenced depictions. Medieval and Renaissance artists drew upon contemporary building techniques, classical ruins, and urban perspectives to render towers with recognizable engineering logic. Spiral ramps, scaffolding, and staged construction illustrate the application of observation and architectural theory, even in imaginative or symbolic contexts. These representations reveal the interplay between material understanding, historical memory, and narrative interpretation, demonstrating how the story of Babel was adapted to contemporary cultural and intellectual conditions. The production of prints, engravings, and illustrated books in the Renaissance further disseminated these images, creating a standardized visual vocabulary for Babel. Artists such as Martin van Valkenborch and Jan Bruegel followed Bruegel's model, emphasizing monumental scale and collective effort. In these works, the tower functions as both a narrative anchor and a didactic device, communicating moral lessons to literate and visual audiences alike. The ubiquity of these images illustrates the enduring power of visual representation in shaping cultural memory and reinforcing theological and historical interpretation. Comparative analysis of visual and textual sources demonstrates the continuity and adaptation of the tower motif. While medieval cosmology and Renaissance humanism emphasized moral and symbolic meaning, the depictions retain echoes of earlier Jewish, Christian, and classical perspectives. Architectural exaggeration, human labor, and divine oversight consistently underscore the ethical and theological dimensions of the narrative, while visual detail situates the story within recognizable urban and geographic frameworks. Art thus becomes a bridge between historical memory, cultural imagination, and theological reflection. These artistic representations also interacted with broader intellectual currents. Renaissance humanists and early modern scholars increasingly used visualizations to reconcile biblical narrative with classical knowledge, archaeological awareness, and emerging perspectives on urbanism. The tower served as a reference point for understanding historical ambition, civic engineering, and divine human interaction. Artistic elaboration reinforced these interpretive frameworks, creating enduring cultural images that shaped audience perceptions for centuries. In conclusion, medieval and Renaissance art transformed the Tower of Babel into a visually compelling symbol of human ambition, collective labor, and divine regulation. From illuminated manuscripts to Bruegel's monumental oil painting, the narrative was reconstructed on canvas and in print, integrating moral, theological, and architectural motifs. These images codified the tower in cultural memory, bridging textual exegesis, cosmological explanation, and imaginative representation. While not historically precise, they provide insight into how visual culture mediated understanding of Babel, influencing European perceptions of language, labor, and moral order. Scholarship would eventually challenge these images, using archaeology, textual criticism, and comparative history to distinguish imaginative reconstruction from historical reality. Initiating the modern critical study of Babel, scholars searched for Adam's tongue. During the Renaissance, humanist scholars sought to identify a primordial language from which all human speech originated. Hebrew, as the language of the Old Testament, was widely considered the most plausible candidate. Intellectuals such as Johannes Reuchlin, Sebastian Münster, and other biblical philologists argued that the diversification of tongues recorded in Genesis 11 reflected historical linguistic fragmentation, and that a careful study of Hebrew could reveal the original human language. These efforts combined textual exegesis, comparative observation, and philological analysis in an attempt to reconcile biblical narrative with the humanist pursuit of knowledge. Humanist research often involved compiling glossaries, cataloging dialects, and comparing grammatical structures across European and Near Eastern languages. Scholars examined Hebrew roots, semantic ranges, and syntactical patterns to propose correspondences with other tongues. Some extended the comparison to non-Semitic languages, attempting to demonstrate historical derivation or influence. The work was motivated by theological, historical, and philological concerns, reconstructing the unity of early humanity, understanding biblical chronology, and confirming the scriptural authority of Genesis. These projects were foundational in the early development of comparative philology, even if conclusions were speculative. Textual sources, including the Hebrew Bible, rabbinic commentary, and classical accounts, were central to this inquiry. Reuchlin, in his De Rudimentis Hebraicis, emphasized Hebrew as a living language capable of illuminating other tongues. Similarly, Münster integrated knowledge of classical Greek, Latin, and regional vernaculars into his linguistic analyses. The scholarly method involved meticulous attention to phonetic, morphological, and semantic correspondences, as well as historical and scriptural justification. These studies illustrate the Renaissance humanists' attempt to harmonize scriptural interpretation with empirical observation and rational inquiry. Despite methodological rigor, these theories faced growing challenges. Field observation, increased travel, and encounters with non-European languages revealed linguistic diversity that could not be reconciled with a Hebrew origin model. Empirical evidence from Arabic, Persian, Turkic, African, and Asian languages demonstrated structural and lexical patterns incompatible with simple derivation from a Semitic source. Reports from Jesuit missionaries in Asia and Africa provided systematic descriptions of unfamiliar grammars, phonologies, and scripts, highlighting the limitations of earlier assumptions. The contrast between textual idealization and empirical reality signaled the need for a more rigorous scientific approach to language. Comparative scholarship gradually shifted the debate from theological speculation to systematic analysis. Philologists began to classify languages according to structural and historical criteria, establishing proto-linguistic families and tracing patterns of divergence. While Renaissance humanists relied primarily on biblical authority, later linguists employed historical, geographic, and phonetic evidence to understand language development. This transition marks a turning point. The Tower of Babel was no longer a sufficient explanatory model for linguistic diversity, and Genesis 11 became interpreted symbolically rather than literally. The decline of literalist linguistic theory also reflected broader intellectual currents. The rise of empirical observation, natural philosophy, and early modern historiography encouraged critical scrutiny of scriptural claims. Scholars recognized that historical and cultural phenomena, including urbanization, trade, conquest, and migration, could explain human diversity more effectively than biblical literalism. Linguistic variation emerged as a natural and traceable process, rather than a divine punishment or primordial event. Theories attempting to trace all languages to Hebrew gradually lost authority, replaced by evidence-based classification and comparative study. Notably, Renaissance attention to language retained enduring influence. Although the literalist framework collapsed, the meticulous recording of vocabularies, comparative grammars, and textual analysis established the methodological foundations for later philology. Humanist scholars preserved extensive linguistic corpora, documented indigenous languages, and refined analytical methods, enabling 18th and 19th century linguists to study historical language change systematically. The Tower of Babel, once a presumed explanatory mechanism for linguistic diversity, was thus reinterpreted as a symbolic narrative within the context of historical inquiry. In conclusion, Renaissance language theories exemplify the transitional moment between scriptural literalism and empirical linguistics. Scholars initially sought Hebrew as the original human language, motivated by theological, historical, and philological concerns. Textual exegesis, glossaries, and comparative analysis structured their inquiry, but empirical observation increasingly challenged these assumptions. The work of humanists laid methodological groundwork for systematic language study, demonstrating that linguistic diversity could be understood through historical and structural analysis rather than divine intervention. The Tower of Babel shifted from an explanatory device to a symbolic and interpretive framework, reflecting the intellectual evolution of early modern scholarship. Empirical linguistics transformed the debate further in the 18th and 19th centuries, establishing historical comparative methods that distinguished the biblical narrative from linguistic reality and inaugurated the modern academic study of language. Language evolved. It did not fracture overnight. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scholars began applying systematic, comparative methods to study human languages, demonstrating that the diversity of tongues could not result from a sudden, catastrophic event as suggested in literal interpretations of Genesis 11. Philologists such as Sir William Jones, Franz Bopp, and Rasmus Rask observed regular correspondences among languages, particularly within the Indo-European family, and recognized that languages diverge gradually over generations. Their work provided empirical evidence that linguistic change is evolutionary, influenced by social interaction, migration, and cultural adaptation. Sir William Jones, in his 1786 lecture to the Asiatic Society of Bengal, famously noted the grammatical similarities between Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin. These observations laid the foundation for historical comparative linguistics, demonstrating that language relationships could be established through systematic phonetic and morphological analysis. Subsequent scholars expanded these methods to trace linguistic families, reconstruct proto-languages, and chart historical divergence. These findings directly challenged the notion of a single, universal language suddenly divided by divine intervention, showing instead that language differentiation is a continuous and traceable process. Comparative studies also examined non-Indo-European languages, including Semitic, Turkic, and African language families. Linguists identified structural features, root patterns, and syntactic organization that revealed independent histories and long-term evolution. Fieldwork by missionaries, explorers, and colonial administrators contributed detailed documentation, enabling systematic comparison across continents. Evidence from diverse linguistic corpora consistently contradicted the hypothesis of sudden Babel-like fragmentation, establishing the principle that language change is cumulative, geographically distributed, and socially mediated. The methodology of comparative linguistics relied on rigorous principles. Scholars tracked regular sound changes, morphological analogies, and semantic shifts to reconstruct historical connections between languages. For example, Bopp's Comparative Grammar, 1833 to 1852, systematically analyzed verb conjugation and nominal inflection across Indo-European languages, revealing shared ancestry and divergent development over millennia. Similar approaches were applied to Semitic languages, illustrating historical continuity in Akkadian, Aramaic, and Hebrew. These studies established that linguistic divergence occurs gradually, shaped by contact, isolation, and innovation rather than instantaneous divine intervention. Archaeological and textual evidence from Mesopotamia further contextualized these findings. Excavations revealed extensive urban networks, multilingual administrative systems, and long-term continuity of scribal traditions. Cuneiform tablets from Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh document the coexistence of Sumerian, Akkadian, and later dialects, demonstrating that linguistic diversity emerged within complex societies over centuries. These records provide concrete examples of natural linguistic change in administrative, religious, and literary contexts, confirming the gradual evolution suggested by comparative linguistics. The implications for biblical interpretation were significant. Scholars increasingly treated Genesis 11 as a theological and symbolic narrative rather than a literal account of linguistic fragmentation. Babel became a story reflecting moral, political, and social lessons, rather than a historical explanation for language diversity. This critical perspective, reinforced by empirical linguistic evidence, shifted historical consensus and informed both philological and biblical studies, emphasizing analysis grounded in observation and structural reasoning. By the mid-19th century, historical comparative linguistics had established key principles. Languages develop over time, share common ancestors within families, and undergo measurable transformations due to social, geographic, and cultural factors. These insights reshaped historical and biblical scholarship, demonstrating that the narrative of sudden linguistic dispersal at Babel is incompatible with observed linguistic patterns. The tower remained symbolically and theologically significant, but it could no longer serve as a scientific explanation for human speech. In conclusion, comparative linguistics in the 18th and 19th centuries definitively demonstrated that languages evolve incrementally rather than fracturing instantaneously. Systematic analysis of phonology, morphology, and syntax, combined with textual and archaeological evidence, established the principles of historical language study. These findings reinterpreted Genesis 11 as symbolic narrative, aligning the biblical account with moral, social, and theological lessons rather than empirical history. The Tower of Babel thus transitioned from a literal explanation of linguistic diversity to a cultural and interpretive framework within both scholarly and religious discourse. This reshaped historical consensus, paving the way for modern critical scholarship to integrate archaeology, textual criticism, and philology in reconstructing the historical and cultural context of Babel. Evidence replaced inheritance. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, advances in archaeology and philology converged to redefine the Tower of Babel from a presumed historical event into a symbolic narrative. Excavations at Babylon, Uruk, and other Mesopotamian sites provided detailed knowledge of urban planning, monumental construction, and material culture. Scholars such as Robert Coldway documented Edamananke's foundations, construction phases, and restoration inscriptions, revealing a long-lived ceremonial structure rather than a site of catastrophic destruction. These findings, combined with the empirical evidence of linguistic development, offered a comprehensive framework that distinguished mythic memory from material reality. Archaeological layers in Babylon indicate continuous occupation, maintenance, and reconstruction over centuries. No stratigraphy or evidence of sudden abandonment aligns with the biblical account of divine judgment at Babel. Cuneiform administrative records demonstrate ongoing governance, temple activity, and economic function long after Nebuchadnezzar II's construction of Etemenanke. Similarly, excavations at Uruk and Ur show sustained urban growth and temple-centered social organization. These findings situate the tower within the normal patterns of Mesopotamian civic and religious development, contradicting interpretations that treated it as an emblem of divine punishment. The integration of textual, epigraphic, and material evidence strengthened this reassessment. Royal inscriptions, economic tablets, and religious texts describe monumental construction projects as expressions of kingship and cultic devotion. Etemenanke, specifically, is presented as a sacred axis mundi connecting temples and the heavens, consistent with broader ziggurat typology. Herodotus' classical account, though distant in time, confirms the tower's existence and monumental scale without referencing catastrophic events. Archaeological analysis thus aligns with textual sources, reinforcing the understanding of the tower as a functional religious edifice rather than a site of sudden divine intervention. Modern philology complements this archaeological record. Comparative studies of Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Semitic languages show gradual linguistic evolution, multilingual administrative practice, and cultural interchange across centuries. These data demonstrate that human languages diversified through social, geographic, and historical processes rather than through instantaneous divine action. Mesopotamian scribal traditions record long-term continuity of communication, bureaucracy, and ritual practice, providing concrete evidence for linguistic stability and incremental change within complex urban societies. The convergence of archaeology and linguistics also clarifies the historical conditions that likely inspired the biblical narrative. Babylon's prominence as a political, economic, and religious center during the first millennium BCE provided a tangible referent for Hebrew memory. The construction of Etemenanke, the city's urban scale, and the symbolic authority of Marduk's cult offered material analogues for the story of Babel. However, textual analysis indicates that Genesis 11 reframes these realities theologically, emphasizing divine sovereignty, human pride, and the origin of linguistic plurality rather than chronicling historical events. Modern scholarship thus situates Babel within a framework of mythic explanation supported by historical context. Archaeological evidence confirms the existence of monumental towers, urban administration, and linguistic complexity, while demonstrating that no sudden collapse or divine catastrophe occurred. Linguistic analysis explains the diversity of tongues as a natural historical process, and comparative studies show that symbolic reinterpretation of Mesopotamian memory was central to the narrative's function in Hebrew literature. Together, these methods distinguish cultural memory from empirical history, clarifying the narrative's theological and literary intent. The cumulative impact of archaeology, philology, and comparative history has established Babel as a paradigmatic case study in the evolution of myth, memory, and historical interpretation. By identifying the material, linguistic, and textual realities underlying the biblical story, modern scholarship underscores the symbolic rather than historical nature of Genesis 11. The Tower of Babel persists as a powerful cultural motif, but its historical status is now understood within the broader context of Mesopotamian civilization and the development of human language. In conclusion, the integration of archaeological data with linguistic science and textual criticism finalized the classification of Babel as a mythic and symbolic explanation for language diversity. Excavations at Babylon and other sites document long-term urban continuity, temple construction, and administrative stability, while philological studies demonstrate the gradual evolution of human languages. These combined findings replaced inherited assumptions with empirical evidence, situating the Tower of Babel firmly within the history of ideas, cultural memory, and theological narrative rather than material catastrophe. Modern scholarship consolidated these conclusions, informing contemporary historical, linguistic, and biblical studies and shaping the interdisciplinary understanding of Babel as a myth grounded in real-world Mesopotamian urbanism. Babel explains, not records. Modern scholarship consistently situates the Tower of Babel within the framework of ideological myth, a literary and historiographical genre designed to account for observed phenomena rather than to chronicle events. In the case of Genesis 11, the narrative provides a theological explanation for linguistic diversity and human dispersion, employing narrative devices, symbolic figures, and structured causality. Ideological myths function as explanatory stories that integrate social, moral, and environmental observation into coherent literary form, rather than serving as literal historical accounts. Analysis of Genesis 11 confirms its alignment with the characteristics of ideological literature. The text introduces a problem, human linguistic unity, and demonstrates its resolution through divine intervention, resulting in the proliferation of languages and geographical dispersal. Narrative markers, repetition, and concise structure emphasize causation and consequence, hallmarks of ideological storytelling. Source-critical scholarship identifies the narrative as part of the priestly and Yahwist traditions, composed or redacted during or after the Babylonian exile, reflecting theological concerns as much as historical memory. The story's symbolic architecture reinforces its explanatory function. Nimrod and the construction of a great tower serve as narrative devices linking human ambition, social coordination, and divine sovereignty. Linguistic dispersal is framed as both a moral and social mechanism, legitimizing the multiplicity of peoples and languages within a theologically coherent worldview. Genesis 11 thus transforms urban and political memory from Mesopotamia, Edominanke, Babylonian urbanism, into a moralized, pedagogical narrative that clarifies human diversity as divinely ordered. Comparative study situates the Babel narrative alongside other ancient Near Eastern ideologies, including Sumerian and Akkadian myths of linguistic or cultural dispersion. Texts such as Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta describe divine intervention resulting in multiple languages, serving royal and cultic purposes while explaining observable social phenomena. Babylonian cosmological texts similarly portray human limitation in the face of divine authority. The biblical narrative reframes these motifs, emphasizing monotheism, moral instruction, and theological causality, exemplifying how ideological myth can transform pre-existing cultural memory. Philological evidence further reinforces the mythic classification. The Hebrew text employs wordplay and semantic markers, Babel, confuse, and Babel, gate, to establish causation and thematic resonance, linking linguistic disorder to divine action. These literary features are characteristic of ideological narratives, combining lexical precision with symbolic function. The story does not attempt empirical documentation. Instead, it encodes explanatory meaning into literary form, consistent with broader ancient historiographical practice. Archaeology corroborates this interpretation. Excavations of Babylon, Uruk, and surrounding Mesopotamian sites demonstrate urban continuity, monumental construction, and administrative sophistication, without evidence for the catastrophic event described in Genesis 11. Similarly, historical linguistics confirms gradual language evolution across centuries rather than instantaneous fragmentation. Together, these empirical findings indicate that the biblical text operates within a symbolic, explanatory framework rather than reporting historical fact, consistent with ideological genre conventions. The enduring historical significance of the narrative lies in its explanatory power and cultural influence. Genesis 11 codifies ideas about human ambition, divine regulation, and social plurality, providing a conceptual framework for interpreting human diversity. Subsequent Jewish, Christian, and Islamic interpretations extend this function, adapting the ideological motif to moral, theological, and geographic reasoning. In this sense, the narrative remains historically consequential, not as literal history, but as a formative structure for understanding human cultural memory and intellectual development. In conclusion, the Tower of Babel is best understood as an ideological myth, a structured narrative that explains linguistic diversity, human dispersion, and social hierarchy through theological causality. Literary, philological, and comparative evidence demonstrates that Genesis 11 functions as explanatory storytelling, integrating historical memory, moral instruction, and symbolic representation. Archaeological and linguistic data confirm the non-literal character of the text, situating it within ancient historiography and Near Eastern literary traditions. The narrative's significance persists as a cultural and intellectual framework, shaping successive interpretations while clarifying human diversity within a divinely ordered world. Its meaning remains historically significant, influencing modern scholarship, cultural memory, and interdisciplinary study of mythology, linguistics, and Near Eastern history. Babel never disappeared. The story of the Tower of Babel continues to resonate in modern cultural, political, and intellectual discourse, long after its historical and linguistic foundations were critically reassessed. Writers, philosophers, and linguists have repeatedly drawn on the narrative to explore themes of human ambition, communication, social organization, and the limits of collective enterprise. In this way, Babel functions less as a record of history than as a persistent symbol for examining human experience, the consequences of centralized power, and the complexities of linguistic diversity. In literature, the Tower has inspired narratives ranging from allegorical poetry to speculative fiction. Early modern European writers used Babel as a metaphor for political hubris and social fragmentation, while 19th and 20th century authors engaged the story to explore communication, alienation, and global interconnection. Philosophers, including Enlightenment thinkers, reference Babel in discussions of human knowledge, linguistic theory, and social order, emphasizing the tension between unity and plurality. The narrative's symbolic flexibility allows it to reflect changing cultural concerns, from cosmological curiosity to the sociology of language. Babel also entered political discourse. Nationalist and colonial writers invoked the story to account for linguistic and cultural diversity, often framing diversity as a problem to be managed or harmonized. In contrast, other modern theorists have interpreted Babel as a critique of imperial ambition, highlighting the dangers of overreaching authority and centralized control. The narrative's embedded lessons about ambition, cooperation, and miscommunication provided a versatile framework for engaging with both domestic and international socio-political realities, demonstrating its adaptability beyond strictly religious or literary contexts. Linguistics and philosophy of language have further engaged with Babel as a conceptual touchstone. Noam Chomsky, among others, references the narrative as a cultural symbol when discussing universal grammar and language acquisition, distinguishing symbolic narrative from empirical evidence. Comparative linguists and historians of language have noted that Babel provides a metaphor for human concern with communication, translation, and the emergence of linguistic diversity. By framing the problem of language in moral and historical terms, the narrative continues to inform contemporary debates about linguistic theory, education, and multilingualism. Visual culture has perpetuated Babel's significance. Artistic depictions, beginning with Peter Bruegel the Elder and continuing through modern media, reinforce the narrative's association with human ambition and architectural spectacle. Photography, film, and digital media reinterpret the story as a commentary on urban development, globalization, and technological complexity. Even without literal historical expectation, the Tower remains a reference point for exploring themes of coordination, overreach, and the relationship between human creativity and structural limits. These visual and symbolic iterations reflect ongoing cultural engagement with the story's central motifs. The persistence of Babel in modern thought underscores the narrative's capacity to integrate historical memory with imaginative reconstruction. While critical scholarship distinguishes myth from history, cultural reception demonstrates that the Tower continues to shape moral, political, and philosophical reflection. Its role as a symbol of both unity and division, ambition and restraint, allows it to function across disciplines and epochs, illustrating how an ancient narrative can inform contemporary thinking. The story's endurance reveals not only the historical impact of Mesopotamian memory, but also the universality of its themes in human social experience. In conclusion, Babel's legacy in modern culture demonstrates the narrative's capacity to engage with enduring human concerns. Literature, philosophy, politics, linguistics, and visual art have all drawn on the Tower as a symbol for communication, ambition, and human coordination. Despite its mythic origins and symbolic interpretation, Babel persists as a framework for understanding collective human experience, the challenges of diversity, and the consequences of overreaching ambition. Its continued presence in cultural discourse underscores the narrative's historical and intellectual significance across millennia. Its endurance reflects human concerns, paving the way for analysis of how the tower continues to influence historical scholarship, philosophical thought, and interdisciplinary study into the 21st century. Before we conclude, if you found this deep exploration of the Tower of Babel enlightening, subscribe to Nightfall History for more daily documentaries. Click the bell icon to receive notifications for our upcoming episodes, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of Babel or Mesopotamian history captured your attention most? Your engagement helps us continue to deliver thoroughly researched, chronologically precise, and cinematic historical content.